anthropology, and the note is that I'm very privileged to have McKenna as a colleague of mine. She's a professor here at Notre Dame in the anthropology department. And it was simply impossible to introduce him and to make sense of his extensive CV without coming up with a piece of paper for me without reading a little bit. Professor McKenna, McKenna, is simply the world's authority on mother, infant, co-sleeping, and breastfeeding. We're pretty honored to have him here.
Except I've never actually breastfed, isn't that?
In theory, he knows everything. So he received his undergraduate degree in anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley in 1970. Then master's degree from San Diego State University in 1972. And his PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Oregon at Eugene in 1975. He moved on to Pomona College, Claremont, California, where he was awarded an endowed chair, and he remained there for 20 years. Fortunately, he was recruited by Notre Dame in 1987
to play on the football team.
And while teaching at Notre Dame, he won every single teaching prize available, including most recently the College of Arts and Letters highest teaching award, the Chili Award, and believe me, that is a big honor and responsibility. After the birth of his son, he began to apply the principles of human behavioral evolution to the understanding of human infancy. He is particularly interested in the relationship between, on the one hand, maternal infant biology, and on the other, recent Western social values and ideologies, and in particular the extent to which more optimal infant care is in conflict with cultural conceptualization and values about human infants and what they need and why. So here he embraces a bio-cultural approach as an anthropologist. At the University of California Irvine School of Medicine, his research teams pioneered the first studies of the physiology and behavior of mothers and infants sleeping together and apart, using physiological and behavioral recording devices. His publishing record is amazing. He has some 140 record-read articles in diverse medical and anthropological journals. He gives continuously lectures to pediatric groups and to parents and he remains in the U.S. He's one of the most cited and present spokespersons of the media on issues of co-sleeping, sleeping arrangement, nighttime breastfeeding, and sudden infant death syndrome and how to prevent that. And the American Anthropological Association, which is our primary professional organization, is indeed recognizing his participation contributions to educate the general public with the 2008 Anthropology in the Media Award, one more award, one of the top awards presented to anthropologists by the association in recognition of his distinguished work in educating the public to the importance of anthropological concepts. He's published 2 books length monographs on sudden infant death syndrome and infant sleep. Couple of very big books, one of them on evolutionary medicine from Oxford, the other one much more recent, Evolutionary Medicine and Health in Perspective, again from Oxford University Press. And he also has a first, probably one of many following trade books for parents. It was published last year with the title of Sleeping with Your Baby, Parent's Guide to Co-Sleeping. And his contribution to us today titled Human Infant Biology and its Relationship to Parental Caregiving. Western Constraints on Creating the Fairest Love, ? So again, please join me in welcoming
So you think I should just quit here and go drifts off into space somewhere. Mauricio, as you could tell, is a very good friend of mine. We are practically office mates, and he's just become an endeared figure in our department. We're very thrilled to have him. This is his first year as an assistant professor here at Notre Dame, and we're very, very proud of him. And I paid him to say all of that. Anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here. It was a great honor to be asked to be able to think about the work I do in the context of the title, which I thought, wow, I think there's really a connection here. And actually, Mauricio articulated it very nicely in terms of what the connection is and the sorts of work that I do, which is actually to look at the ways in which cultural values and ideologies often masquerade as science or become embedded within it, to determine the types of questions that are asked, the kinds of ways we interpret data, in this case, mothers and infants sleeping together. And in some ways, Western cultures and ideologies, as I'll hope to convince you of today, act as enormous constraints in both mothers and infants discovering what the fairest love really, really is, which I would have to give my opinion on, which is not to say scientific, but I actually do think that the fairest love of all that we all are hopefully fortunate enough to experience is that which occurs between parents and their babies, the most selfless love of all. I'd like to think that my own experiences, we were only lucky enough to have one child, but that my experience isn't altogether different from others, and that is that every time you think that you come to love this baby as much as a human possibly can, it just gets more and more and more and more, and there doesn't seem to be any constraints on that human capacity to give and want to give. So I really feel very privileged, friends, to be able to investigate this area that has such wonderful scientific meaning and implication, but also in so many ways, and maybe that's what motivates so many anthropologists, that articulates with so many of our own personal daily experiences and those wonderful questions, why do we feel this? How come humans do that? You know, I always thought that anthropology was the major for those people that could never really quite make up their minds as to what they wanted the major is, because it legally and theoretically encompasses biology and culture and evolution and development and the articulation of all these beautiful lines of evidence that are brought to bear on whatever that particular topic is about humanity that you are interested in. And you'll see my own work, not to any credit of my own, just the kinds of material it requires me to consider to provide any kind of reasonable proposal or solution or perspective on this particular subject. So I want to start off with really basically some interesting cultural observations, things that lead me in my own work to really question the assumptions that scientists have made, particularly the pediatric community, about what's good for babies, with, remember, the thematic unit at the bottom being that I feel that mothers and babies work very much against, and fathers as well. I don't mean to exclude them, but I've concentrated on mothers, and I'll come to the father issue a little bit later. But I really think our culture makes it very difficult for both mothers and babies to find and to enjoy and to experience that fairest love. And so that's going to be pretty much my theme for today. If I can get going. The fairest love I ask, as you might. And I've given you my bottom line in a very emotional, personal sense. I think the most selfless love we will ever know is, in fact, that comes from our parents. But I want to have you travel with me and make the kinds of observations, some very simple, not very profound, but once considered, they do have meaning and application. Please keep in mind that no peoples anywhere on the earth ever considered asking some fundamental questions about babies that we have to ask seemingly in this culture. And one beginning point for us all to consider is no babies were ever separated for any moment of time from a human body, from usually their mother's body, but other allo mothers, substitute caregivers, etc., that put the baby always in sensory contact with their babies, with their mothers. Most human infants know only, as we speak, most human infants know only constant contact and caregiving with some other body. And this is representative of, or explained by, one should better say, the extreme neurological immaturity of every baby born. Every infant, as I'll be showing you a little bit later as to why, every infant born is a premature baby relative to the degree of neurological maturity of other mammals. Every single baby born with 25% of their brain volume, 75% of their brain growth is going to occur and won't become complete until they're 21 years of age. This is extraordinary in the world of mammals, and we rival, believe it or not, the joeys of the kangaroos that are carried in their mother's pouch. We basically exterogestate. Humans finish their gestation after the womb, and this is, you can begin to see how the sort of scientific perspective that tends to reward and look for individualism and autonomy and to value this, how this could right away in some ways come in conflict with what is true about humans, this huge distinction, the level of need and vulnerability and neurological immaturity at birth. But I just wanted you to start out with me with an understanding that most humans, as we speak, are never outside contact. They're carried, they breastfeed day and night. It's not so much on demand as simply relatively continuous for reasons that are biological in nature. The rather dilute, perfect quality of human milk that, while perfect for babies, requires babies to feed fairly continuously because of the lack of caloric density. And I'll get back to that in a little while, too. For the human infant, its fairest love begins with the body. It's a very sensory-based experience for human infants, and perhaps you all know this already at some level. Babies don't know to be in love with their caregivers. There's no concept of love, obviously. There's no awareness even of self yet. The only thing a human infant in this premature state experiences is whatever is given to it with respect to its committed caregivers, the physical properties of the body, etc. Its capacity to experience love, to encounter what we as adults call love, is through the external regulation that its mother's body contributes to its own physiology. And this is the challenge I'll ask you to consider with me today. The capacity for scientific institutions to appreciate that there is no such thing as a baby, as Winnicott said, and I'll come back to. There is a baby in someone. And to actually understand why babies' hearts beat as they do, why their hormonal levels achieve what they do, how their sleep architecture changes, how they breathe, how they grow, absorb calories, and how they develop is strictly based on the presence of the mother's body and or, and I will argue a little bit later, very least the presence of some body that regulates that baby. A real challenge to the notion of the analytically distinct unit of study, which is usually the smallest unit possible, literally and metaphorically, the baby. But I will argue that that's a wrong conceptualization for scientific research. And I'll argue that in many ways, as my psychology colleagues know, psychology was never kind to human infants, or at least Western babies, in trying to understand them in terms of themselves, rather in terms of the dyads which they are actually a part. And why I think this is so important is that these physical sensations, and remember, there's no cognitive meaning put on them yet by the baby. There's no psychological meaning. There's no social meaning. It's strictly, truly physiological. That's in and of itself all that it is. But it's fundamental to the baby's physiological system and development. But, and here's the catch, it is the scaffolding. This physicality is the scaffolding on which those merging systems of cognition and psychological development and emotional development and social relational issues build and emerge from. So while I on one hand emphasize, strictly speaking, the physicality of the experience of love for babies in the beginning, at some point with the developing brain and the neuronal arborization of it, development of it, the baby begins to attach meaning to these sensations and self-worth. And they're very, very critical. So they fuse with and become one and the same with systems that will really distinguish humans from other animals, the self-awareness and ability to attach meaning to their experiences. Does the human infant exist apart from the mother? We can truly ask on a scientific basis. I've already commented on Winnicott's beautiful theme that for me was the really beginning point of my own research, really thinking about the actual application of this very profound scientific statement. There is no such thing as a baby but a baby and someone. And then my colleague Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy, biological anthropologist, who put it somewhat differently, but nonetheless with the same scientific implication, and that is, for species such as primates, the mother is the environment, the microenvironment to which only the baby is adapted. A human infant is not adapted to the earth, to the ground, to food. It isn't particularly adapted even to breathing outside the context of a pacemaker and a rhythm giver. And when babies are placed next to a rhythm giver, their mother's bodies, they have many fewer apneas and breathing pauses. Even that fundamental adaptation is indeed mutually regulated, etc. The point being that all primates to a certain extent share this tremendous, prolonged, delayed dependence on the caregiver. That's why they're primates. And learning is critical in the context of the nature of the relationships that develop within them. Critical. But primates, humans, take this even a step further, and maybe even 10 steps further, in the degree to which their brain is undeveloped at birth and will be shaped by the sensory experiences they get in these 2 to 4 to 6 months of critical development. Again, returning to this observation, and that's all it remains at the moment, is to think that most humans, as we speak, they don't ask, where will my baby sleep? How will my baby feed? Should I lay my baby down prone, supine, or on the side position? How actually shall I care for my infants? Pediatric journals or parenting manuals, thank goodness for them, don't exist in the bookstores, and so inevitable is the breastfeeding, carrying, co-sleeping model that really most humans that we think of today, contemporary folks, don't know those are questions to ask. The unfortunate thing for Western industrial peoples is if you ask the question, someone's always willing to answer it. And in every single question, we answered it wrong, and 500,000 to 1 million babies died because of it. And I don't toss that figure out lightly. The dismantling, even in urban Western societies, of the supine back sleeping necessary for breastfeeding, necessary because mother needs to be there to breastfeed, back sleeping, breastfeeding, proximity sleeping, co-sleeping, that complex is critical for infant survival, and it even now proves to be critical for our babies, optimizing their success. And don't get me wrong, I'm quite aware of the ways in which, unfortunately, in our complex society, in our urbanized lifestyle, those otherwise inherently beneficial arrangements can be transformed into something dangerous. But don't mistake what truly is the pathology for what is in fact normal. And what has happened, as I'll be arguing for you later, which has been a remarkable achievement, and I put that in quotations, is we have made that which is normal abnormal, that which is inherently good inherently bad, and that which is thought to be an adaptation a deficiency. And this is something that cultures can do, because it's our claim to fame. We don't need genes to determine how we think and conceptualize and innovate. Culture can go on its very merry or sometimes unmerry way, quite independent from the biology underlying it. It eventually catches up, but no one caught this particular mistake or series of mistakes, putting babies prone. That has been singly the leading cause of our Western babies dying in the thousands from something called sudden infant death syndrome. Even as plastic and as flexible as humans are, another claim to fame, we have our adaptive limits. And some babies are pushed to them faster than our others because we do exhibit a huge range of variability with respect to our constitutional characteristics and or the degree to which deficits might find expression. And I'll come back to this issue about how microenvironments can act as buffers to help particularly vulnerable babies pass these transitions into the extrauterine, the outside the uterine environment. And I guess I've been speaking so far and alluding to it at very least that a great characteristic of humanness that anthropologists spend a huge amount of time studying is the ways in which values and ideologies and chosen ways of living, are really quite independent of any biology, any specific kind of biology. And indeed, that's why, I shouldn't put it quite that way, but the expansion of the neocortex, the newer part of the brain, has permitted a tremendous amount of learning and flexibility, problem solving, innovation. I don't have to tell you this. The very microenvironments we create, sitting in chairs, wearing clothing, wearing eyeglasses, I mean, you name it. We construct the material environment basically, and we construct tools to permit us to adapt to environments for which even a human primate was not at some level theoretically designed to be able to live in. You know, we are able to create, in a sense, artificial organs for ourselves through our cultural material innovations to permit us to live in areas that a little tropical primate like ourselves were, in a sense, at some other level, were never designed to live. But here we are, and we've been fairly successful so far, despite our little glitches here and there. The point being that culture doesn't require time, as the same would be for genes. Changes much, much faster than biology, and much like David Barash has used the metaphor of the tortoise and the hare. You have on one hand the tortoise, the biology lumbering along, the same Paleolithic bodies we had 20 to 50 to 100,000 years ago. Perfectly balanced, perfectly good. They work, but they're developing and being expressed in environments for which the biology could never, ever have imagined. I mean, obesity is the big issue. I mean, there's every good reason for your taste buds to celebrate with joy when you eat a potato chip or a corn dog or whatever. Salts, sugars, fats, my gosh, you weren't assured of any of that. They were rare. They were delicacies. And that biology is not going away. You can't write a memo and say, by the way, they no longer work in the environment for which we're designed. Biology really never anticipated being able to go into Martin's, our local grocery store, and buy about, 18,000 calories without expending practically none, and you being able to eat them all so quickly without energy expenditure. Well, there you go. Little mismatch here between your biology doing what that biology should do, but being out of place with the environment within which it's finding expression. And that's the question I'm asking with babies. A beautiful statement by Sussman. He says, although the biology of infancy is universal in historic time, that is, lending its constancy through not just hundreds of years, but hundreds of thousands of years, human perceptions of infancy and what we think to be or require to care for them are social constructions and subject to rather immediate, I should add, historical change. We don't wait for the genes to change to construct ideas about what's in the best interest of the baby. And you can right away see how that would conform to the immediate kinds of social, cultural, political, and religious changes and characteristics and beliefs as well. The problem is that the babies may not get the memo. But even if they did get the memo, they're not able to change. They're pretty much a little Paleolithic body, doing very well, thank you very much, when presented with the stimuli that their bodies are expected to be presented with. I loved Montague's little descriptor here of the kind of particularistic cultural world you and I live in, and it's a rather sad statement. He's one of my intellectual heroes, actually, and he says, in the Western world, it is perhaps a great advantage for an infant to have a sensitive skin or diaper rash or some other dermatological disorder, for then at least it can be assured of receiving something resembling an adequate amount of cutaneous stimulation. That is, rubbing cream on the baby's body, gives the baby a little skin-to-skin contact that it might not otherwise have. When you consider a little environment like this, I don't know whether it would occur to you, the multiplicity of things, the tremendous second-to-second events that are going on in this otherwise seemingly prosaic, beautiful, stable picture. You have breath clashing. You have olfactory smelling cues being received by mother and baby. You have mother breathing in baby's carbon dioxide, baby breathing in mother's carbon dioxide. You have a baby and a mother listening to vesicular sounds, a pacemaker, a rhythm. You have that baby gently touching its mother's face, stimulating the Pansean glands, the changed endorphin levels that let calories be absorbed by that baby's intestines. What you have here is a most utterly dynamic environment, an array of mutually regulating, expectable, normative experiences that this baby's body is like a puzzle just being fit in one piece after another. for breathing, for heart rate, sleep architecture, for body, as I say, caloric absorption, hormonal level. There isn't one subsystem of this baby's body and the brain that is underlying and integrating these neurons and these synapses that is not in fact operating every second of this baby's sleep. Compare this to this beautiful picture taken from a sleep journal that was advertising drugs that can control male urinary problems, to be honest. But it's a beautiful picture, and you show this to most Westerners, and they'd say, oh, isn't it a beautiful baby? Oh, that's lovely, etc. But if you showed this to most human beings in the world, within seconds, I promise you, they would say, but where's the mother? What an odd picture. So too normal, so dramatic is it for an infant even to be for seconds portrayed outside the context of it, the environment within which it lives, which is the mother. But for most Westerners, obviously, this wouldn't be particularly noticed. And I think that's important because it reflects what scientists think when they go into the lab to study normal sleep, that it isn't the mother-infant that they think of to understand infant sleep physiology. It would be the baby, and unfortunately, too, a baby fed with the milk of another species, artificially, with no delivery by the human, and or no physiological response of that very specifically human milk. But I call this the disarticulated baby, because this is the baby that is sleeping in an environment for which it was never designed, and one that's unexpectable. It's a novel environment. Without doing a thing to this baby, you're challenging this baby. And think of what 8 hours or 6 hours or 12 hours means to a baby that's lived 2 weeks or 6 days or 4 days. It's a huge amount of time of separation, and the time relative amounts are very extraordinarily different when you think of it in terms of how many minutes a baby has lived. Now, Dr. Ferber, how many of you know who Dr. Ferber is? Well, anyone that has babies will know. He wrote a $1 million book called How to Solve Your Child's Sleep Problems, without ever telling you that babies never had sleep problems to solve. It was always the adults' sleep problems to solve. And that's an extraordinary distinction to make, because who are you ascribing the problem to, and what does it mean in any organic language? It means that you have a patient that needs care, that is exhibiting behavior that is seemingly not biologically appropriate. But I think if you're picking up on the messages I've been saying so far, you're beginning to think, maybe babies just aren't supposed to follow that particular cultural script. And that's why every week, in every parenting magazine, you will find in our society the very same article, How to Solve Your Baby's Sleep Problems, that will never, ever be solved, because it isn't the babies that have the problem. It's the cultural script that's being imposed on the babies. And the babies could be, as I'll argue later, acting absolutely biologically vigorously and appropriately by protesting, and their behavior is being interpreted as negative, deficient, developmentally unsound, when in fact your beginning point was what was off in the sense of what constitutes normal, appropriate biological behavior. Now, just to show you, though, how fast cultural ideas can change, and that's good and it's bad, much to Verber's credit, who believed in crying it out, keeping the baby separate. He would say, originally, he said, up until last year, sleeping in your bed can make an infant confused and anxious rather than relaxed and reassured. Even a toddler may find this repeated experience overly stimulating. Now, here's what turned my career around when I started reading such things, and I'm thinking, I wonder if Dr. Ferber ever talked to a 2-month-old baby to find out what left that baby confused and anxious. I think you could figure out what I'm saying here. And to claim that it's the socially sleeping baby that's confused as opposed to the one that's sleeping next to its mother's body or father's body is telling you something awfully interesting about the power of ideologies and our willingness, apparently, to believe it, even in the face of enormous other mammalian data that suggests it would never occur in other mammalian species. But he did come around, and he says, children do not grow up insecure just because they sleep alone or with other siblings, away from their parents, and here was the big change for him. And they are not prevented from learning to separate or from developing their own sense of individuality simply because they sleep with their parents. This was an enormous step and a real change in the ideology, and I'd like to think our research was beginning to help him see this. But I wanted to make some other observation to see what you think of this. Do you recall, some of you that were baby sensitive or conscious, in the news reports, NBC, and they actually would say this, the scuttlebutt in our popular culture was something to the effect, did you hear, Dr. Ferber may be changing his mind about co-sleeping, and that he might even support it. Now, with all due respect to Dr. Ferber, because if it was me, I'd be saying exactly to you what I think some of you are going to think I should be saying. What is most interesting is why in the world would any of us care what Dr. Ferber thinks about whether your baby sleeps close to you or far away. And this was like a drum roll moment in our culture. Is Dr. Ferber going to approve of my co-sleeping? Don't you think that's really the most interesting issue? Who should care? What has happened to parental confidences and knowledge of their own children to be looking at somebody else who doesn't even know the dynamics of your family, let alone the characteristics of your infant, that parents will always know more of? And the larger issue isn't Dr. Ferber. It's the externalization and the medicalization of issues that are not medical. Where your baby sleeps is very relational. Now, it happens to be as well, the case I'm making to you, unbelievably physiological and serious in that sense. But it has been medicalized, and that's another word for culturalized in our society, because medicine and culture, contrary to perhaps your first take on this, medicine is exceedingly cultural, and the science of medicine is first and foremost cultural. In fact, there's a syndrome that my colleague, he's an evolutionary biologist, very, very famous, George Williams, says, and that is Westerners suffer from what he calls the syndrome of medical normalcy. That if Westerners do it, then not only is it right, but everybody else should do it too. And surely this was the case when, as I'll be telling you, I'm jumping a little bit ahead, when we first got the physiological instruments needed to measure the physiology of infant sleep. The babies that were studied were, of course, not breastfeeding, which is part of sleep and nighttime experience for babies, nor, gosh forbid, found to be measured in a co-sleeping environment, which at the time these techniques came out was akin to sexual abuse in the 1950s. Sleeping with your baby? Holy moly. Haven't you read Freud? Oedipus is lurking under the bed in the pillow, waiting to get out. Anyway, well, you can see the situation. The measurements of how babies normally sleep, the scientification of it, were reflecting the folk wisdom of these very learned scientists. But what was the folk wisdom? It was completely fallacious. That if you want to understand normative human infant sleep, you study a solitary bottle-fed baby and you get all these nice measurements of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Wow, impressive. And you publish all these papers, thousands of them. The only problem is, it isn't really how babies sleep. Nor if you're claiming species-specific, species-wide, normal human infant sleep, that's a very odd and alien version to be measuring. But then it traps everybody, and here's how it works. The only way you can get your baby to sleep healthfully is to do what? To replicate the conditions within which the numbers were acquired. Bottle-fed, solitary sleep. So that's an example of the kind of perpetuation of a mistaken, fallacious ideology that was culture-based to begin with, to become scientized. Very objective. This is science. But you see the difficulty. And why would that happen? Well, we have 100 years where, may I just be offensive for a moment, that some older white men sitting in a chair who never even took care of their own children were beginning to tell mothers what they should be doing and why. It never emerged out of hundreds of empirically based studies of how babies live. What do people, human beings, do with these babies? There was never any study. It was all based on people's armchair theorizing. I think it's very, very good for babies to be in their own bedroom, to teach them self-sufficiency. Yeah, that's what we need here, self-sufficiency. We go for individualism and autonomy. And I want my baby to grow up to be independent. Well, what's so interesting is if you want an independent baby, that's not how you get it. What you do is you sleep with them. And you be with them in the beginning. And believe me, they'll be able to be both independent and interdependent and empathic. And now those studies are all coming out as you might predict. That most parents never got what they were promised, and it was the opposite. And it makes a great deal of sense, but the ideology was so powerful that what was sensible or seemingly logical or was being suggested by everything else was just saying, well, I don't know what's that over there, but that doesn't have anything to do with this. And sometimes science works that way because of statements like this. This is a perfectly wonderful physician who wrote this book. This happened to be a mother, a physician who was a mother that wrote this. Babies should be trained from the earliest days to sleep regularly and should never be woken in the night for feeding. Very, very common advice. Where the heck did that come from? Do you think there was some study done that showed that somehow babies were better never being woken in the night and never being fed? Absolutely not. Baby should be given his own bedroom. Little sexist language there too, I might add. Baby should be given his own bedroom from the very beginning. He should never be brought into the living room at night. What's that? And here's one. Quote, the constant handling of an infant is not good for him. I'll say, who says? The less he is lifted, held, and passed from one pair of hands to another, the better, as while he is young, his bones are soft, and constant handling does not tend to improve their development nor the shapeliness of his little body. Totally the opposite. I don't know why I didn't like capitalizing my letters here, but the newborn infant should spend the greater portion of his life on the bed. I'm sure Marianna Wheeler was a beautiful and wonderful person, but she just didn't know what she was talking about. And here's the most bizarre innovation that could only emerge out of a kind of a touchless society. The advertisement for this new baby product is, if you've ever wished for a, quote, a hand to leave behind so that your baby would feel as if you've never left the room, your prayers have been answered with the Zaki infant pillow. Now, isn't this the most bizarre thing you've ever seen? I mean, talk about disembodied. There's a good post-reconstructive statement and post-construction statement. What am I saying here, Maurizio? Anyway, postmodern statement, sorry. Too much reconstruction on my mind. Anyway, I just think this is the most hideous-looking thing I've ever seen. And look what's coming out of county health bureaus and departments. Some of you might know this. New York City, their campaign to protect and to benefit babies. Babies sleep safest alone. Oh, really? On what basis is this evidence being presented? I could tell you the story, but at this point I won't. We would never get through the lecture. And then in Philadelphia, for you to rest easy, your baby must rest alone. And then the worst of all, these ideologies working themselves into the legal arena that are actually threatening the civil liberties of families, coming out of a county health agency in Los Angeles, that everybody, if you ever are in the presence of something like this, you stand up and you challenge these people making these kinds of statements. These are utterly offensive, and these people should be brought to task for making these kinds of statements. This woman says in the Los Angeles Times, we know the value of holding your child, cuddling your child, loving your child, but if you take the baby to bed with you and fall asleep, you are committing a potentially lethal act. Imagine the nerve of this person making a statement like that. I hope you understand why this statement is wrong. It's one thing if a person is taking drugs and is irresponsibly endangering a baby. The act of bringing your child to bed, and you realize what she was really saying, don't you? You're committing an illegal act. This is a second away from that statement. And this is an utter threat. Talk about threat to the fairest love. This is a total threat to a political right. And it's, as you can tell, it gets me very upset. But I really think that it isn't one person that needs to confront these people. Because this is part of a non-conscious cultural ideology. This is what I'm trying to alert you to. I don't know what it is about our society. For a democratic society that values the rights of the individual to be informed and make up their own mind, we seem very ready, willing, and able to give up our own rights and power for decision-making to others. Why else is it that parents are afraid to admit that they're sleeping with their baby? Or that they buy a crib without any intentions of using it in case a child protective services agent comes to their house? I don't call that a democracy. And I feel something really terrible has happened to our culture of parenting and, indeed, our democratic structure. When people like this woman, Dion Tilton Durfee, is permitted to use a newspaper to make a threatening statement like this to our good parents, that it's an absolute contradistinction to everything we know that is scientifically true about what babies need. And it is a mixing of events and evidence and a choice that's being made. That's the point. These people are making a decision to dismiss the important caveats and critical qualifications as to what distinguishes, in this case, safe co-sleeping with your baby from unsafe co-sleeping. You would not find that dismissal when it comes to cribs. Why? Because someone else has decided for you that crib sleeping is worth investing in. A baby dying in a bed is a tragic problem to be solved. A baby dying in a crib is a tragic problem to solve, but a practice to preserve. A baby dying in a bed is a potential crime, and the remedy for that is not to attempt to ameliorate what it was that actually killed the baby in the bed, but to eliminate the practice. And that is not a decision that our Consumer Product Safety Commission is in a position to make. That's a decision that's yours to make. What is worth preserving? What is worth investing in? And this is how these things slip through without people understanding there are important distinctions to be made. Why? How could this be? Why would I so far surprise you with anything I've said? It hasn't been particularly profound, but it has to do with culture. And I have to think about these issues myself. Why is it that a person on the street is much more willing to see damage, danger, and deleterious effects of a mother sleeping with her baby than asking the question, is it safe for a baby to sleep alone? Why wouldn't that be the question, not is it safe to sleep with your baby? And that's because of a misinterpretation of certain kinds of deaths of babies. Not that they're not all tragic, but the ways in which those deaths are being used to make an argument. And aside from that, we do have a context. We have decided that we believe in experts, child care experts. And when you believe in that, that is a suggestion that parents don't have a particular way of knowing that's valid for themselves, which is inappropriate. Obviously, it's okay to have somebody study and have a wider, nexus of knowledge, but it's altogether different that negates completely and eliminates the validity of other forms of knowledge, particularly the knowledge of the mother. Emphasis on technology rather than bodies with respect to babies. Average expectable outcomes. Sometimes these behaviors are very complex. And we do these big population studies, and we don't capture the confounding variables, but we find salient variables. And it could look like something that is, on an individual basis, inherently protective, could come out looking dangerous, and that's the situation of bed sharing. It's not bed sharing that's the problem, it's how it's practiced. Emphasis on social values and ideologies, individualism, autonomy, separation. We have these abstractions. It's odd we do because it isn't really that we favor in our culture. We're very much a culture that favors familialism. When children become 17 or 18, we don't just say, oh, can't wait, see you later, Charlie, have a good life. You know, we strive towards interdependence and familialism, yet the same kind of independence that we seem to want our 2 to 4 month old baby to have isn't seemingly the kind of independence we want our 14-year-old son to have, or our children to have at 18 and 22. There's this strange abstraction of what individualism means and when it should be valued. There's so many factors. Bottle feeding made it easy to think of babies separable from their mother's bodies, and that in fact that whatever substance you could give them would be superior to what a woman's body would make. And now at least that's been corrected. We know that the perfect food is in fact breast milk, and it's designed perfectly for every species, brain growth, life cycle variables, life history variables, etc. And we've become a very breastfeeding friendly culture, and that's good. The problem is the other half of it's missing, right? Who is it that's breastfeeding? Well, it's the mother. And when do they breastfeed? During the night. So breastfeeding during the night. That means moms and babies sort of need to find themselves and, relatively speaking, be close together. Mutually reinforcing moral ideas. This is a fascinating issue. We tend to define babies' biology in terms of who we want them to become, rather than who they actually are. And we gear their experiences not for who they are, but our perception of what experiences will make them a kind of an adult that we think we want them to become. The problem is that in some abstract level, the kinds of characteristics that you want the adult to have are not always borne out by those procedures that would work for the adult. Babies are very different in the sense of their needs, and they need lots and lots of contact. You can not give a baby too much affection and too much contact. I'm not sure there's even an adult you can give too much affection and too much contact, but nonetheless, we have tended to think that individualism, self-sufficiency, and confidence are somehow acquired by self-disciplined babies. And I think I dare say in this audience, I'm a Catholic myself, that original sin has not served our babies well. Because behind this feeling, you know, the notion of being spoiled, you don't want to spoil that baby. Babies do not know what being spoiled means. They don't think out, ha, I'm doing it again. Got it, just where I want them. But if you read some of these books, you might think they do, that they have an agenda. And you can even see the titles of the book, Winning Bedtime Battles. And it's all adversarial before a parent even experiences their babies. It's a fight. You better get on top of that 2-month-old baby. Whoa, they are tough. They're going after you. And you know, it affects parents, especially if authorities say it. Well, now to the technology. This is rather dramatic. I just had to throw this in. There's nothing wrong with cribs, but it's how you use cribs and the placement you bring them in. Humans have been using tools for 100,000 to 1,000,000 years because our babies were born so neurologically immature they couldn't hold on, they can't walk, talk, control their bowels, eat, thermoregulate, they can't do very much. And it's the human response to these situations that made this birth of such a vulnerable baby possible. So it isn't really cribs, but it's putting a crib in a different room without the sensory interaction and contact. That's the issue, not cribs. And of course, this bottle, other species feeding, was a huge, unfortunate step in Western culture. So many babies died and continue to, and it deprives infants of contact and delivery. You know, when you feed a baby, there's a heck of a lot more going on than just simply receiving some milk. There's an array of beautiful sensory contact that's causing brain cells to develop. The scaffolding effect I was telling you about. Oh, and now we have the Fisher-Price walkie-talkies. Well, isn't this interesting? Well, let me tell you and be the first in your block to know, it's completely the opposite of how they should be used. You can do nothing proactive by listening to the sounds of silence. But if you want to use them and help your baby breathe better, and arouse better and exhibit vital signs of life, pump the amplifier into the bedroom, letting the baby hear all the sounds and noises of its family. Babies will breathe to it, they'll respond to it, they'll sleep happily against it. But you'll do nothing putting, a receiver in a bedroom. Now, the bottom line is the baby should never, this is another cultural construction, Lee. I'm putting the baby down for nap. Shh. Putting the baby down. This is a weird thing. Now, I'm not trying to say that it can't be convenient. I had one baby, at least. I know. To be honest here, I would literally walk like this so the floor wouldn't creak and my boy wouldn't wake up. So I understand this. I'm just telling you, it's a very interesting cultural construction to train babies to sleep against silence. They actually physiologically respond much more healthfully against the sounds of their brothers and sisters and unexpected intrusions, auditory intrusions. That's what we looked at when we saw them in the sleep lab, mothers and babies sleeping together. Moms' bodies, not trusted. Transportation, it's not a bad thing, but what's happened now is that we have what I call transformer baby furniture. You know what I mean? Remember when the transformers were all around? The truck could become a plane, could become an animal, could become a tractor. Well, now we have the sleeper that can become a car seat, can become a high chair, can become a carrying chair. And what's happening to the baby? Their heads are all getting flat because their heads are being pushed against these hard surfaces. And everybody thinks it's supine sleep, the back sleep. It's not the back sleeping. The babies are not being carried. Carrying is development. So it's okay to do the snug leaf. Humans have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, but make sure we carry our babies into skin-to-skin too. That's very, very important for neck development. The double-edged curvature of the spine occurs by virtue of the baby controlling its neck. They walk earlier when they have a lot of strength in their neck. So we tend not to model ourselves after, the contact issues. I put the little incubator in there. I don't mean to be a basher of technology. I'm part of it. We're all part of it. We can't deny it. When we need it, we can't. It's like what your father and mother taught you. Nothing in excess, everything in moderation. Balancing these various needs and the trade-offs. We all have trade-offs, no doubt. Now, another interesting thing that's occurred, though, is relevant to our conference here, is how easy it is to slip, and this is true for infancy and parenting recommendations for how to parent, etc., to slip from a perceived medical good into a moral good, being a judgment of character for the baby. Now, and for those of you that have babies, the first question that you usually get after the second week or maybe even the first week, is your baby sleeping through the night yet? And of course most parents might say, oh, well, no, not quite. And the person, oh, I see. Well, they don't say what would be the logical thing to say, oh, what a bad baby. Why don't you turn that thing in for a new model? Because what they will say, if you happen to be the one in, 100, oh, my baby's sleeping through the night, which always scares me because I don't think they're supposed to, you would say, oh, what a good baby. What a good baby you have. Now, what in the world does that moral caricature have to do with whether a baby is sleeping through the night or not? But you see how this slippage of the medical perceived good isn't even good for babies. I worry about they're not prepared to sleep through the night in deep stages of sleep without lots of arousal, oxygenation, just like older people. Older people think they don't have a good night's sleep. And I try to remind them, it's a good thing you woke up because you probably would be dead. Because waking up is oxygenation, it's arousal, it's cardio rhythms. They're not 20 anymore. They need to wake up just like babies wake up. Their cause of waking up is different. It's immaturity. And the maturity of breathing systems and arousal patterns, etc. The part of the brain for babies that lets them sleep has nothing to do with the part of the brain that lets them wake up and to protect themselves from prolonged apneas or breathing pauses. So you want babies in that sensory-rich, interacting environment. That's how babies thrive. But it's not necessarily the culture. I knew I could work this picture in because I love it so much. But our culture has seemingly permitted me to use this. When up is not up and when down is not down, when what is biologically good for infants is conceptualized as bad, what is normal is considered abnormal, as I started with in the lecture, when infant adaptive responses are interpreted as deficiencies. This sort of picture is one of those beautiful Escher-like copies. But I think this is a beautiful visual metaphor for what's happened with respect to our interpretations of infant behavior. Particularly, I'll give you just one example. When babies protest sleep isolation. In the clinical books, they're thought of as having a sleep problem, or they're deficient developmentally. They're not able to self-regulate. But you know, in the environment within which crying and protesting sleep isolation emerge, the predictable pattern, those babies are the ones that are vigorously adapted. They are developmentally superior. They're attempting to ameliorate what in the wild and what in the context within which it evolved is a life-threatening situation. Separation from the caregiver. The babies that acquiesce, that don't protest, that sleep through the night, the good babies, that's the baby that's putting itself in risk. That's the baby that wouldn't have made it. And so, not understanding what your beginning point is permits you, well, I suppose it goes either way, but I guess what I really meant to say is your beginning set of assumptions about what's normative has a huge amount to do with how you interpret whatever babies do in various situations. Don't forget, this beautiful little baby here that's been visiting us, this is about a 3.6 million year old little baby that has that length of an evolutionary history behind it. It's not a little 2008 just born, created little beautiful baby. This baby comes to us with millions of years of allelic characteristics and changes. It didn't get the 2008 memo. By the way, when you live in South Bend, Indiana, here's what you need to do and be. That's culture. That has nothing to do with that baby, our beautiful baby. It's doing exactly what every baby in the world, his or her age, is doing. It knows exactly what to do in the confines of its own biology. That biology is very conservative, and by right it should be, because it's very, very successful when matched with the environment within which that system evolved. And that's why these mismatches can be serious and can cause things like SIDS. Most cultures in the world don't even know such a thing. There's no lexical description of a baby that goes to bed healthy and doesn't wake up. Doesn't mean babies don't die, but they don't die at the age they die of SIDS. It's from dysentery and infectious disease loads, etc. And when they're being weaned is their most vulnerable period. How many of you know this book? Talk about Fairest Love, huh? Love You Forever by Robert Munsch. I can't even read the book mostly, so I've carefully chosen parts that won't make me completely cry in front of you. Love You Forever, it says, nothing, my reason for reading it, nothing better, as far as I'm concerned, documents the conflict between culture and biology in this little book. It's the story of a mother, baby's born, that's the first episode. And all through her little boy's life, at different stages, infancy, childhood, teenage, young man, and then older man, she sneaks in wherever she is while he's sleeping. And she holds him in his arms. And she sings this little song. This is the first little experience you encounter in the book. A mother held her new baby and very slowly rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while she held him, she sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Now, just jumping ahead, it's such a small room. See this little picture here? This is just skipping the childhood stage. You see her at the door, crawling in, and her teenage son is sleeping. But at night, when the teenager was asleep, the mother opened the door to his room, crawled across the floor, and looked up over the side of the bed. If he was really asleep, because of course she didn't want to embarrass him, teenagers aren't supposed to sleep with their mom, she picked up that big boy, rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. While she rocked him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." A little picture of that in there. Okay, now I'm going to come back to it at the end as sort of the... Oh, aren't computers fun? Oh, what you know. Before I come back to the end, though, I wanted to show you, I was telling you earlier how culture leads scientists to ask some questions and do their tests, and that we always think scientists being objective. But of course, anyone that's lived long enough, you begin to understand how, like anything else humans do, it's infiltrated. You can't. You're a human being. You have your biases, and you don't always know what they are. And that's what anthropology is so rich. It makes us jump out and look back. You can look back from an animal perspective, across species, but also across culture perspective, and even though you're still a human being, and obviously can never escape the confines of what you think to be normal, healthy, good, you can every so often at least appreciate what a non-parochial view can do in expanding your view at least of what is normal, in the sense of a human normal, not a particularly parochial, intra-cultural, normal, etc. But I love this example. And it's one of these postmodern titles. I know it sounds so boring, but it's just so beautiful an example. Culture producing science coming back to reify and validate the culture. And it is by numbers, by science. And it was an experience I told you how when we could measure through polysomnography, how babies sleep, brainwave patterns, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, REM. The scientists in the 50s, they did thousands of these studies. At day 1, at 2 weeks, at 2 months, at 6 months, the whole year, thousands of papers, all looking at the brain waves and defining how many minutes and this and that. How does the 6-month-old sleep? How does the 2-month-old? But every baby studied was bottle fed, was practically makes comatose babies compared with breast milk. And then, of course, they were sleeping alone. No intrusions, no arousal, no interactions with the mother. So they derived the measurements, repeated them across the whole year. They published all the papers. We're now getting a clinical scientific picture of how the human infant sleeps. Remember George Williams' little phrase, the syndrome of medical normalcy? Well, this was supposed to be the representative not of an interestingly different Western model of how babies sleep when they're not breastfed or sleeping with their mother, but this is it for the human species. And our pediatric sleep research community still fails to admit this is not how babies sleep. When you're talking about the universal human baby and its biology, they're catching on because it's so undeniable. And the architecture is so different when a baby is sleeping next to its mother and breastfeeding. It's huge. And we publish papers on it. They're all accepted in these prestigious journals. They've been out there for 10 years. About 44 papers. Pediatrics, sleep, Journal of Behavioral Physiology, Archives of Diseases in Children, Lancet, British Medical Journal, top journals. Still, I think they think it is an interesting little aside. It certainly hasn't been incorporated into, oh my gosh, the methods were just a little bit ethnocentric, weren't they? Just a little bit. So there you are. I mean, I don't tell you that to brag about it. I'm just saying I think it has to be an example of something. Because we published all those papers in the top journals, where all those other papers would be published, the solitary sleep. But interestingly, it hasn't had much of an impact in pediatric sleep. You could make the argument, well, yes, it just is not helpful, that, okay, McKenna and colleagues, you're right. But our babies do sleep alone, and we want them to, so what the heck? This is how they sleep. I mean, okay, people can make choices. There's trade-offs, but don't try to pretend that it's how babies everywhere sleep. It's arrogant to do that. And it is a misrepresentation. not to put those caveats and qualifiers. And yet the beat goes on. And we're all trying to match our baby's sleep to something that we will never achieve again, if we ever did. Because most of our babies are breastfeeding, and that alone means they are not sleeping like that. Like these quantified cow's milk, formula-fed babies are sleeping. Does biology matter, do you think, guys? Take a look at this. It apparently matters to this little baby. You know what I love the most about this photo? What do you love when you really just look at it? What catches you the most? The mother. I think. Too amazing for words. Watching that mom laugh at her baby. I just think it's beautiful. Anyway, the point being, I want to skip a little bit ahead. You're probably getting tired. Here's our American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, for those of you that have babies, how realistic do you think it is to actually say to a parent, never let a baby fall asleep at the breast? I mean, this is like saying never let a baby or a human being swallow, or never let a human being take 10 breaths in a row. I mean, this is the very context within which an infant falling asleep evolved. This is it. And what in the world are you doing telling parents, for one, they'll never be able to match up to it. What's the point here? Well, the point here is a belief system, meaning that it may be great for the baby, but it may not be great for the parent, because that baby wants to, believe it or not, do the same thing again. The nerve of this baby. Yeah, it's the manipulative little creature again. It's going to want to sleep on your chest again. In fact, you know what it's called, this? It's called a negative association. A negative association. Does that tell you in whose interest somebody is thinking? It's not a negative association for the baby, is it? It's a positive association for the baby. What could be safer in every stretch of the imagination than falling asleep in your parent's arms? But it shows you how our culture, what it is that our culture, in this medical culture, this pediatric culture, is thinking. Now, please keep in mind, I'm setting up a dichotomy, almost like an adversarial relationship, because I'm trying to be dramatic, to be provocative, to get you thinking about this. I don't want you to hate pediatricians. If I was a pediatrician, do you think I wouldn't be absolutely thinking this way? Of course not. Of course I would. I mean, I'm a citizen of a Western culture, and I read things. I go to medical school. I didn't necessarily get anthropology. I didn't learn evolutionary biology. I didn't learn about non-human primates or any of that. So it's really just contact with material, ways of thinking, what anthropological paradigms do that permits me to be so obnoxious today and talk like I know everything. But I'm trying to say that those experiences, though, are really critical in what kinds of solutions and answers. This affects a lot of people. And then obviously this way of thinking affected a lot of babies that didn't make it, or this dismantling of this system. Now keep in mind, any system has its issues or problems. No biologic system is perfect. Hunters and gatherers or foragers that carry their babies all day, they don't have the life of Riley. I don't mean to suggest that, nor does it guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you're trying to interpret when things go wrong, or if you're trying to understand what you're claiming is correct, or at least as correct as any human can describe a system that's usually fairly typically complex to begin with, you've got to try to get as close to the original context in which the system is put together and for what purposes. At least for your beginning point. It doesn't mean it has to be your end point. What you do with it. What you do with this perspective doesn't mean that every one of you should go home and sleep with your baby necessarily if you had one. Because what would also be important is how do you feel about it. Is it comfortable for you? Because your baby would know in a minute if it wasn't comfortable for you. So it doesn't lead to any direct recommendation. but it's the foundation by which very specific kinds of recommendations owing to particular families could be constructed to be ultimately in the best interest of more families than not. So, does that mean, Maurizio, that I'm on my way out, so to speak?
Enjoyable. In theory,
yes.
our time is up, but...
Okay. Well then, I think that my main point is, and if you take this home, this is it enough, that it is for understanding these issues, the fairest love. It isn't the mother or the baby. It is actually to understand the infant. You literally have to describe, not even simultaneously both. And that's a very seemingly radical construction for a culture so steeped in science where the method is to isolate the units to smaller and smaller elements so you can understand it. So imagine me saying, in this culture of science or science of culture, no, the unit of study is both the mother and the infant and the mutual co-regulation that's going on. That certainly complicates the way the science from this perspective would have to be done. So anyway, just to end then, this little book, which I highly recommend, to show you, this is one of the little things where she sneaks to her son's house and she holds him in his arms with this great fairest love of the mother. And then here's the sad little part. Well, that mother, she got older. She got older and older and older. One day she called up her son and said, "You better come see me because I'm very old and sick." So her son came to see her. When he came in the door, she tried to sing the song. She sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always." But she couldn't finish it. She was too old and sick. The son went to his mother. He picked her up and rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And he sang this song, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my mommy you'll be." And there's his fairest love, holding his mother. And then the more profound moment, when the son came home that night, he stood for a long time at the top of the stairs. There he is, pondering at the top of the stairs. Then he went into the room where his very new baby daughter was sleeping. He picked her up in his arms and very slowly rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while he rocked her, he sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby, you'll be." And that's the end of the story. But I just think it's so relevant because seeing the caricature of the mother doing anything to be close to her infant and child and thinking that that's bad, that's not good. I just think it so beautifully represents one of the constraints that we have in our culture that we have the power to change. So I thank you for our... Any comments, questions?
Okay, 3 little comments. The first, you said how strange it is that the world of science does not receive that information. I think there are very powerful reasons for that, because separating the mother from the child is essential as the mother works. So the integration of women into work life, ever since 200 years, the integration of the women into career life really furthered all of that. That is number one. The second, when you mentioned that there was parents or couples afraid to admit that they were sleeping with their baby, and these outside experts were questioning that, then you asked, what happened to our democratic society? I think it's not an issue of democracy, it's an issue of intermediate institutions. And that is something about which America, if you read it so clearly, that is really what made America so great, this power of these intermediate institutions. So I would really separate them. So the third is a question. Have you ever presented these results in a Confucian culture?
Oh, I think we find it very peculiar. I mean, that you'd be making these arguments, if I'm understanding the bottom line of your question. No, the answer to your question is no, I haven't. But what you expect from me would be the response.
I think they would be very interested. They would be very interested to get more ammunition against this Western individualism which threatens their culture, or against which they try to assemble their roots.
I see. Well, I can tell you, and I'll come back to your very first question or statement that you made, that we did measure, and I didn't show you really any of the science that we actually did, but how entrained the physiology of the breathing in the mother really is, and the breastfeeding behavior, how it changes when you put mother into the picture in the sleep architecture. There isn't one single parameter or variable that is not significantly altered by the presence of the mother in terms of both the infant's physiology and the baby's physiology. The infant's physiology and the mother's physiology. The shifting of sleep architecture from deep sleep to light sleep, synchronicity of arousal, the amount of time they spend at each sleep stage together, that sort of occurs by virtue of each kind of arousing the other. And oddly enough, the perception of the mothers, even in the light of all moms being pretty much sleep deprived, but the perception that she's more well rested when she's a breastfeeding mother sleeping next to her baby, compared with when they separate and breastfeed. And the numbers of minutes that they actually both sleep is greater. But in relationship to Karina's statement, which is a fair one, that our urban life is complex, and there are trade-offs for everything. And my point is that we can't take my perspective and the data we've acquired and necessarily channel it into a singular, therefore, recommendation, just as you're suggesting. But it does provide a foundation for parents to make decisions in their own trade-off and to understand what they or their babies might be feeling. So in other words, I think this is a necessary step to understand and to acquire this knowledge in order for all parents to make the most informed decisions with their own value systems and their own careers, etc. And keep in mind, there's an essentialist, not intended essentialist aspect of this in the terms of feminism, that is, that the mother's body might be, and I don't want you to mistake this, that it's only the mother's body that can do this. Now, it is absolutely true it's only mother's body that can add the breastfeeding component to it. But it is absolutely not the case that the father's body cannot do everything that we found that our mothers do in terms of changing sleep architecture, breathing CO2, and changing the baby's breathing, body temperature. All of these fundamental regulatory systems are equally as changed by father's body, and I think that's very important to know, because it doesn't separate the dynamic. It makes breastfeeding, singularly unique. That's not any news. But that baby's body is prepared to be sensitive to the body, not to the sex of the body, other than the breastfeeding issue. And then your comment about intermediary institutions, I think that's very important, but I think, and you're right, I think, because these are county health agencies that are coming out with these kinds of statements, and sometimes attorneys of local areas, one in Oregon, saying that any baby dies in the bed with their parents, they're going to be prosecuted for the full extent of the law. That's very, very inappropriate. And those are the kinds of things. And actually, in the places it happens, there has been an amazing rise and response to that. The latest one being Bend, Oregon, out in the west. But, the loss of freedoms, and, I'm not by nature a political activist, but I have been for the first time. I went to Berkeley for 4 years, from 66 to 70, when it was the most tumultuous years in the history of Berkeley. And I've never been so moved to be alert and vigilant to what I see happening in this regard. It's very important for me to be protecting parental rights.
You mentioned Dr. Ferber's book. Do you have any recommendations of books for new parents that are more friendly for the...
Yeah, actually the Sleep book, I think it's called, with William Sears. Very sensitive to different family structures. He's not afraid to say co-sleep. It works really well for those families where it works very well. And once again, it's point, every family constellation is different. The needs, the arrangements, the safety issues, But that's a wonderful book, really is. Yes.
Turn sheet and go off topic just a little bit. What about some of these same findings with young siblings sleeping together?
Yep. Well, many of you probably have experienced it. It's functionally a little different. Particularly, you wouldn't want a baby sleeping next to a toddler. That's very dangerous. Many babies have died in the beds with their mothers, not by virtue of the mothers, but by 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds laying on top of their brothers and sisters, not knowing that that's something you can't do. But in terms of sibling co-sleeping, well, let me just put it this way. Start by saying it's very rare for most humans in the world ever to go through periods of their life when they're sleeping alone. Again, this is a very Western thing. The idea of sleeping alone is really an anathema to most people. Even contemporary Guatemalans will search out all their friends if their family's gone to sleep with them. Sleep is not sexualized in the sense you ask somebody, oh, who are you sleeping with? And it's like, oh my gosh, who are you having sex with? I mean, that switch does not occur in most cultures of the world. That's one of the constraints and one of the things that happen with thinking of babies in the parental bedroom. Oh my gosh, that's where sex occurs. And it actually is very relevant to this argument. The conjugal relationship, the rise of romantic love, occurred in the 1700s, 1800s in Western Europe, and very much it was a constraint on seeing children not as contributors or harmonious participants, but as competitors, and permitted Freud to begin to think about all these issues. That's a very culturally interesting take, and we're very odd in seeing children apart from the reproductive unit. And another constraint on why the average person on the street will say, oh, well, is it safe to sleep with your baby? And, and it's complicated. It has all those other things operating too.
I think one more question that is going to be in this conversation upstairs. The room needs to be set up for the next.
Where did all these lethal constructs come from that says it's bad to sleep with, where did the lethal aspects come in?
The lethal aspects coming out of impoverished urban communities where bed sharing, it's called bed sharing in Western cultures, Cleveland, St. Louis, very impoverished, usually African American populations where bed sharing has always been a pattern, but in these environments, in some instances where there's social chaos, there's too many people in the bed, there's people routinely sleeping on couches and sofas that are called bed sharing, and it's very dangerous to sleep routinely with your baby on a couch or sofa. A lot of babies die there. Recliners, chairs, in bed with other children, and it is absolutely disproportionate that you get these high instances. You'll hear in the newspaper, 5 more babies died sleeping with another person, and they don't give you any of the details of it, as if that's unimportant. But you should say, well, how did the baby die? What was the specific condition? But the actual cultural tradition of thinking badly about it permits many groups to say, you don't need to know the details. The baby shouldn't have been sleeping with its mother, and that becomes the cause of it, not the fact the baby was sleeping prone in the bed, or the mother had smoked during her pregnancy, or was taking drugs, or had alcohol. There was a case in Texas where a tragic situation where an 18-year-old mom drank 18 cans of beer, went to bed with her baby, and unfortunately her baby didn't wake up. And the president of Civil Alliance had the audacity and nerve to say, he's been talking for years about the safety of bed sharing. It's not cool to bed share, she said. And it isn't even a sign, she said, of educated parenting. There was no mention of the little fact that this poor woman had drunk 18 cans of beer before she went to bed. And that says it all in terms of the unwillingness of the details and the importance of what kills the baby to be recognized, because they disagree that it could be a practice worthy of saving and solving the problems associated with it, as is true for crib sleeping. Can I get one more question that you had?
Kind of in passing, you mentioned, you said the word investment when you were referring to cribs, et cetera. So I was wondering if there was something behind that, and it's like we're talking about an intermediary in this kind of phenomenon. I wonder if the market would play that kind of role, because all of these things require some kind of product to replace.
Well, the formula companies, and they're huge. They have been operating to constrain and constrict and limit even advertising breastfeeding. Let's face it, that's the world we live in. And the crib manufacturers, I don't want to blame them for that, but the Junior Product Manufacturing League, they've actually been very careful to support choices of parents to co-sleep, much against the Consumer Product Safety Commission's threats against them. So I don't want to join the crowd and say it's all about the cribs, because I don't think that's so much the issue. Because as I say, you can co-sleep